How did a small victorious war become the most humiliating defeat for the Russian Empire? The end of the 19th century. The Russian Empire is headed by Nicholas II, a man who inherited power but not control over the situation. Discontent is growing in the country, reforms are being postponed, and protests are explained away by extremism and the influence of radicals. The authorities convince themselves that there are problems, but they do not require immediate solutions. The crisis is acknowledged, but it is not considered a reason to change course. At such moments, war begins to be seen not as a catastrophe, but as a tool. If things are difficult at home, an external storyline is needed, one that allows the conversation to shift from reforms to greatness. I'm not hinting at anything, but the parallels with today in this whole story are simply incredible. For Putin, that storyline became Ukraine, and for Nicholas II, it was the Far East. They didn't plan to start an open war either. Everything was done through treaties, railways, leasing territories, and temporary military presence. A very familiar set of phrases for any era that doesn't want to call things by their real names. Russia enters Manchuria under the guise of infrastructure. The railways are presented as an economic project, but right behind them come garrisons and security forces. Then comes the lease of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, formally temporary but in practice indefinite, judging by their behavior. At the same time, Japan stops being convenient. It modernizes rapidly, grows stronger, and behaves like a state that no longer accepts other people's rules of the game. This is noticed in St. Petersburg, but not taken seriously. Japan is not considered an equal opponent, and therefore not seen as a serious threat. And this is the key mistake. Against the backdrop of the Boxer Rebellion, Russia sends troops into China to protect its citizens and the railway. The uprising is suppressed, but the troops remain. Japan grows nervous, proposes negotiations, and signals that the situation is becoming unstable. St. Petersburg responds calmly. It is believed that the sheer size of the country will compensate for any potential problems. Nicholas II did not prepare for war because he did not believe it could become a problem. In his view, if war were to break out at all, it would be short and victorious, useful for domestic politics, a small, victorious war. On February 9, 1904, the Japanese fleet strikes the Russian squadron at Port Arthur. Formally, it is Japan that starts the war, but in reality, it becomes clear at this moment that confidence was mistaken for strategy and self-deception for calculation. And from then on, Russia would be fighting not only against Japan, but also against a reality it had refused to acknowledge for far too long. At first, the Russo-Japanese War did not seem like a catastrophe. It was still seen as a temporary complication. That is precisely why it later became a catastrophe. Problems appeared immediately, but they were not considered systemic. The empire turned out to be vast but unwieldy. The army was large in number, but stretched across thousands of kilometers. Railways existed, but they were not designed for rapid troop deployment. There was a navy, but its main force was in the Baltic Sea. Everyone knew all this in advance. They just considered it acceptable. At the height of the Russo-Japanese War, Leo Tolstoy wrote the text, "Come to your senses," about Russians' willingness to agree to war if it was explained to them properly. That is precisely why people tried to ignore this text at the time. And that is exactly why today it reads as if it was written not in 1904, but just yesterday. We have a separate video where we analyze why Tolstoy understood everything before anyone else, and why this still irritates people in the corridors of Russian power. The link to the video is in the suggestion, the description, and the first comment. The fall of Port Arthur became a turning point, not because it had only military significance, but because its loss destroyed the main psychological calculation. Until the very end, the capital assumed that the fortress would hold out. Decisions were delayed, orders contradicted each other, and responsibility became diffuse. When a system does not allow for a bad outcome, it is always unprepared for it. Within the country, tension grew in sync with defeats at the front. The war, which was supposed to strengthen the authority of the government, began to undermine it. Dissatisfaction was no longer marginal. It could no longer be dismissed as the actions of a few troublemakers. It was becoming widespread and noticeable. The authorities' response remained the same: soothing phrases, promises of a turning point, assurances that everything was under control. Society was offered not analysis, but patience. This is always how things are done in Russia when there is no clear exit plan. Russia was suffering defeat, and it was obvious to everyone, at the front, in the rear, and in the mood of society. Defeat was stubbornly refused to be recognized as a sign of the failure of the chosen course. The fall of Port Arthur became the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The fortress, which people relied on psychologically rather than strategically, did not simply fall. It shattered the confidence that everything was going according to plan. In the capital, until the very end, everyone assumed that this could not happen. Not because calculations suggested so, but because such an outcome did not fit into the acceptable worldview. After that, governance increasingly came down to providing explanations. The question, "What are we doing wrong?" was replaced by, "How do we present this?" That's when a decision emerged that was supposed to restore a sense of control. If the problem is in the Far East, then even more of the fleet needs to be sent there, even if that fleet is on the other side of the world. The Baltic Fleet is sent on a months-long voyage around the world. Ships not designed for this war wear out even before meeting the enemy, but the movement itself is perceived as action, and therefore as a solution. Scale is supposed to replace strategy. It didn't. The destruction of the Russian fleet by the Japanese became the moment when there was nothing left to explain. It was a defeat that could not be blamed on chance or on the executors. It revealed the limits of a logic where persistence substitutes for calculation. After that, the war was essentially lost, but no conclusions were drawn. They tried to minimize the defeat, repackage it, present it as a series of misfortunes. That is precisely why the war ended, but the crisis did not. The Russo-Japanese War became a breaking point for the Russian Empire. After it, the system never returned to its previous state. The defeat exposed what had previously been hidden behind scale and rhetoric. The administration could not cope with the crises it itself created. The result became apparent almost immediately. In 1905, the country entered a period of mass protests, strikes, and uprisings. The authorities were forced to make concessions they had not planned and to make promises they never intended to keep. The empire survived at that time, but it was not stability. It was merely a postponement. The mistakes were not reflected upon, the decision-making mechanism did not change, and responsibility remained diffuse. This fracture did not disappear, it was simply deferred. In 1917, already against the backdrop of a new war, the system finally collapsed. The Russo-Japanese War did not destroy the empire directly, but it was the first to reveal its limits. The authorities do not know how to acknowledge a strategic mistake and adjust their course without a catastrophe. And if you remove the dates and names, what remains is a very simple pattern. War is perceived as something controllable. The crisis is acknowledged, but it is not considered a reason to change decisions. Defeats are explained, not analyzed. Society is offered patience instead of a plan. The system tries to buy time, considering it a strategy. At the beginning of the 20th century, this process took 13 years, from Port Arthur to 1917. Today it is happening faster, not because history has sped up, but because mistakes are no longer offset by resources and inertia. The most ironic thing here is that this mechanism has been thoroughly described, has long been known, and has already led to the same result many times. But every time, it continues to be used as if for the first time, with the hope that this time, scale, patience, and the right wording will finally work. That is the exact reason why this story is so difficult to perceive and understand as the past, and yet so instantly and clearly recognized in the present. Thank you for your attention, friends. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. Support the creator on Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, where you'll find extra videos and early releases before the official premieres. Use the YouTube sponsorship feature and be sure to send donations to the armed forces of Ukraine. Wishing all Ukrainians a swift victory.